Well, good morning. And on behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, I'd like to welcome you to this conversation this morning with FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. The conversation today will be led and moderated by CSPC's ABSHIR Chair, Mike Rogers, former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and also somebody who is a leader in the private sector, in technology business, and also an important thought leader on 5G. And as we look forward even to 6G, somebody who's really helping shape the thought field on the importance of communications technology to our economy, to our national security, and helping us think through all the important aspects of that. So we're really proud to have Mike lead the conversation with Commissioner Carr this morning. I will ask if folks want to pose questions, please go ahead and submit them via the Q&A function. If time permits, we'll try to weave some of those in towards the end of the conversation. But we're excited to host this conversation today. CSPC has been focused for many years on great powers competition, particularly on the competition over geotechnology, high-tech, advanced, and quickly developing technologies within which we are in a serious competition with global rivals who see the world in a very different way than we do. The stakes for this competition are very high. Today, we're going to focus on the communications aspect of that, particularly 5G and what comes next. These issues are critical for a number of reasons, as I'm sure Chairman Rogers will remind us. The security implications are large, very hard to overstate. If you watch the news lately, you'll read about the latest foreign hacks of American corporate systems. As we are increasing the connectedness of our economy, leveraging 5G technologies as they continue to roll out, the implications just get bigger and bigger. There's also a competition aspect to this. We're in a challenge with authoritarian countries who have basically, I wouldn't even say blurred lines, no lines between government and private sector business, within which we're competing with a set of competitive rules and norms that work for us, but that have to be taken into account the nature of the global challenge that we're in. So with all those things swirling around us, we enter a conversation with FCC Commissioner Carr about where we are currently looking at 5G and 6G. I do want to mention one of the things. CSPC is about to publish a report on our take on this matter. And we hope that that adds a lot of intellectual thought to this discussion, to the focus on both technology policies we think make a lot of sense, and also how we can coordinate better with our like-minded allies in this structural competition. So we're excited to host this. With that, let me go ahead and turn it over to get us started with the main event to Chairman Mike Rogers. Mike, good morning.
Thanks, Glenn. Great to see you. Thanks for all the work you're doing at the center, and to Dan Mahaffey and Joshua Kaminsky, who've done a lot on this 5G topic. We're really kind of on the cutting edge of this when nobody else was interested. So thanks for all of that and all of that great work. I can't tell you how honored I am to be with Brendan Carr, who has been a warrior in the best sense on technology and making sure that the United States is positioned to win. Not artificially positioned, but in a position to win if we can get all our other factors together. And certainly Commissioner Carr he knows where all the bodies are buried, really. He was the former general counsel to the chairman, Ajit Pai, and now he is the senior Republican commissioner at the FCC, and continues to push kind of a rational, thoughtful approach on how we clear the underbrush to allow us to compete in 5G. And so, Commissioner Carr, thank you very, very much for agreeing to do this. And really, thanks for all the work that you're doing. It is a bit of a thankless job over there at the commission when you're slugging away trying to make sure that the United States doesn't get overrun by our adversaries' technological advantage. So for that, I want to say thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks to you for your leadership. I mean, the work that you did on chairing Intel, you were really ahead of the curve, and you saw the threats coming out of communist China long before so-called telecom experts saw it. And the work that you did and the leadership that you provided is really where we've been playing catch up the last couple of years and implementing and acting on a lot of the warnings that you provided from chairing that group. So thanks for the work that you've done there. It was a game changer, and has enabled us to take very concrete action in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, thanks. Thank you for that. So let's do a little bit of, we have a lot of participants today. Some are all in on 5G, some are trying to figure this thing out. Can you talk a little bit 4G to 5G, where you think we are on 5G? I mean, there are some saying, yep, we may have stemmed the tide. Some, there are advertisements saying, no, we're winning. I'd really be interested in your honest assessment of where you think we are. And then we can start talking about 6G. People are thinking, my God, I just tried to figure out what 5G is. You all are talking about 6G. You guys are driving me crazy. So if you could help me walk through that, that would be great. And I think our listeners would really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a great question and a great way to start it out. I mean, maybe the best way to think about this is to think back to the transition we did about 12 or 13 years ago, going from 3G to 4G, and think about how much your life changed during that transition. When we were in the 3G era, think about how you got across town. You'd have to phone a taxi, you have to stand in a taxi line, you have to pay exorbitant rates. Think about all the rides and places you just decided not to go to, or think about how you did banking. You only had to go to your only option was to go to a brick and mortar bank. You had to stand in those rope lines. You had to fill out your check sheets using those pens that were lashed to the table and were always out of ink. And as we made this shift from 3G to 4G, it unleashed the app economy. So now you have Uber, Lyft right on your phone to get you across town. You've got all sorts of banking apps right there on your phone. It addressed pain points in people's lives, and it fundamentally changed so much of how we conduct business. That same transition is happening with 5G. It's going to be this entirely new wave of innovation that is developed on top of these platforms. And the reality was, a few short years ago, we were not in a good position when it comes to 5G. Communist China saw all of the economic opportunity that came to the United States because of our world-leading 4G platform. All those applications we mentioned were built right here in the US because we had such a strong 4G platform. So Communist China wanted to replicate that, and they wanted to be the world leader in 5G. And they went about doing what they do, which is, massive government-backed construction projects to try to take the leadership role. And to some extent, it was working early on. From 2012 to 2016, the build out of new cell sites in this country had essentially flatlined, and new cell sites are the building block for 5G. We were putting up in this country about 3 new cell sites a day back then. And China, that period of time, was putting up 460 new cell sites a day. So what it was taking us 4 years to build, they were doing every 9 days. The spectrum side, it wasn't much better. We had 0 mid-band spectrum, which is really key spectrum for 5G. And so we went about trying to change that. This is when there was a lot of analysts, including Ernst & Young and others, saying that China was about to unleash a 5G tsunami, making it nearly impossible for the US to catch up. And again, that data wasn't looking good. So we updated and modernized our infrastructure rules to make it easier for the private sector to build in this country. We went to work on mid-band spectrum and freed up large swaths of mid-band spectrum, and took on a lot of fights in order to do that. That was not easy. Both infrastructure and spectrum were difficult fights. But the upshot was, where we had built 708 cell sites in 2016, in 2019, we built over 46,000 cell sites in this country after modernizing our rules. Internet speeds were up 3-fold. We leapfrogged 20 countries in terms of mobile download speeds. Competition increased, and we have nationwide 5G covered. We have places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, that are live with 5G. And to me, that's a far better measure about where we are as a country than the fact that, New York and San Francisco have 5G. So the reality is we have caught up. We have positioned the US now to have a leadership role. And, the policies we put in place going forward will decide whether we can capitalize on that and keep moving forward or we fall behind. But it's a real tremendous success story the last 3 or 4 years, where we've gone from getting blown away by communist China on 5G to allowing the US private sector to build the strongest 5G network in the world right here.
Yeah, no, that's great. You know, and again, the reason I liked this approach, and I thought that you and the former chairman were so spot on this and did so yeoman's work, is it was never about protectionism. It was really about trying to unleash the American market. To me, that is how we're going to win. And I know you all embrace that first and foremost, and you talked about it and you pushed on these issues. And it really was get the government, the regulatory constraints out of the way so that we could try to compete with what China doesn't have to do, which is ask permission of anybody to do anything. And so that to me was just a yeoman's work at a really important time, and probably has made the difference for us in 5G. And I don't want to understate it, because I think that's exactly what you all did when you were going through that. Can you talk a little bit, just again, for folks that are, you know, for those of us who get up every morning and live this stuff, that, you know, you talk about the spectrum moving or opening up. So from 3G to 4G, they had access to certain spectrum. And now to get to 5G, we had to have access to other. Can you just explain a little bit what that means? So if I'm there going, what the heck is this? And by the way, the G stands for generation. So there isn't any sneakiness behind this. This is the third generation, the fourth generation. So when we start talking about sixth generation, people shouldn't be intimidated. It's like, okay, that's just what's coming next, the next technology. Could you help us just walk through in layman's terms? As you know, as a chairman in Congress, you can't be that bright. So you got to kind of go slow and go through all this.
Sure. You know, so the best way to think about spectrum is to think of it in three buckets: low band, mid band, and high band spectrum. And historically, mobile wireless services, 3G and 4G, operated predominantly on low band spectrum. So to translate into megahertz, that's 600, 700, 800, 900 megahertz spectrum. And that spectrum is very good for propagating and providing coverage and covering long distances, penetrating into buildings. And that's principally what we built America's 3G and 4G networks on. One of the innovations with 5G is the ability to use mid-band and high-band spectrum in ways that we couldn't have before. That was one of the evolutionary benefits that led you to get that additional G with 5G. So we had to push more mid-band spectrum out there, which in the US at least, there was a tremendous amount of that spectrum that was tied up in the hands of federal government users, and they have their important missions, but we had to balance the interests of their missions with the economic and security benefits of the US having a leadership position. So we pushed mid-band and high-band spectrum out there. The way to think about it is as a layer cake. So that base layer is going to be low-band spectrum. That's going to give you wide area coverage. That's going to be the spectrum that predominantly you're on rural and remote communities. Then think about mid-band spectrum as giving you much more capacity. So this is where you get higher throughput, streaming video services. In that mid-band spectrum is where you start to see more small cells get built. So low-band spectrum, wide area, macro towers. Mid-band spectrum is going to give you some more capacity. And then on top of that, you've got high band spectrum. That's very, very high throughput. That's basically fiber-like performance wirelessly. And to lead in 5G, some countries were betting only on mid-band. Some were looking heavily on low band. And what we did right in this country is we built that as 3 layers. And that gives you all of the performance characteristics that you're going to need for 5G.
Yeah, and meaning if I need that 5G speed, I can get it, but you can also push it back to 4G capabilities if I'm just having a conversation, with my great aunt, right? I mean, I don't necessarily need 5G for that. And that's what I think what you're talking about is this ability to move between those layers as needed. So if you're a high sensor factory, you're going to need lots and lots of data moving really, really fast. Boy, that's a 5G contender. If the guy on the line picks up his phone to call home to check in, probably doesn't need all that 5G spectrum. And so that's what I think is going to set us apart as we move forward, where China doesn't seem to be interested in that layered approach because they want to win. Right? They think the way they win is dominate that 5G space. Can so what is 6G? We're kind of going through 5G, and we'll come back to, do you think we're where we need to be and what maybe else we can do? But what is 6G? What does the next generation look like? What is that doing? So 4G is the kind of commercialization of the internet, apps and other things. 5G is these sensors, driverless cars, remote surgeries, those kinds of things. What's 6G? What is it?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, we're in really good shape, as I mentioned, with 5G, but we're not anywhere close to waving the mission accomplished banner just yet. We got a lot of work to do to get that spectrum out there. We've got some funding that is in the pipeline at the FCC that I'd love to get out there so that we can get 5G built out even further into rural communities. And 6G is going to build on top of this. You know, all of the standards for that obviously aren't going to be set at this point, but you can bring in what we call even terahertz spectrum, which is even higher than the high band spectrum that we're using for 5G. So there's gonna be all sorts of additional performance benefits that come with 6G. And, you know, I get that some people are gonna be like, you know, we're just talking about 5G, it's not fully rolled out yet. You know, why do we have to talk about 6G? And I would say you're probably right from a consumer perspective. You know, you really shouldn't be getting pitched 6G by any of your carriers for quite a while now. But from a regulatory perspective, we got to make sure that, you know, we are looking at the services that are going to be delivered, the type of spectrum they need, and do the legwork now so that when it is ready for the commercial marketplace years down the road, there's not a hiccup there. So we're really starting to look at that. And generally, if you step back, whenever you have these generational upgrades, we run a playbook that we've done from 3G to 4G, 4G to 5G that works very well. And the two key pieces of that is spectrum and infrastructure. And every single time that we upgrade, we push more spectrum out there, and we go even further in terms of streamlining infrastructure rules, because each upgrade requires more and more cell sites and high-speed connections to function. So those two key components of spectrum and infrastructure are things that we need to keep moving forward on and not see any retrenchment on. And I would add two more to that we learned through the 5G experience, which obviously is security and standard setting. They've always been there, but I think we need to add some more emphasis to it. As we talked at the outset on the security piece of that, a lot of people, not yourself, but a lot of people were slow to see the threats coming out of communist China and Huawei. And I think we obviously cannot afford to do that again with 6G. We've corrected the ship a little bit with some of our measures we've taken to rip and replace Huawei gear, but we need to start from a clean sheet with 6G and say, look, we're not going to allow Huawei gear and then rip it out at taxpayer expense. We're just going to get that right from the get-go. And then standard setting process, there's a lot of work going on. You know, the communist China regime wants to exercise its power in the standard setting body and try to skew those in a way that's going to be beneficial for their homegrown and backed entities. So we got to continue to be diligent about making sure U.S. interests are represented in the international standard setting process. So looking at 6G, that's the playbook: more spectrum, more infrastructure, and then added emphasis, I would say, on network security and standards. And if you look back again, the last couple of years, the U.S. government worked very closely with our allies in Europe and in other areas to make sure that they saw the threat from Huawei. And again, they were very, very slow. And some people looked at the U.S. and the Trump administration and said, you all are trying to lead people to a tougher position on Huawei, but no one's following. And I'll say that it took some time, but the tide did turn. And now you see Europe very much embracing the same approach that the U.S. has with respect to the threat of Huawei ZTE gear. I mean, look, I was in Matanya, Kenya. This is a small, dusty town about 2 or 3 bumpy hours outside of Nairobi. And there is, you know, Huawei billboards and Huawei posters all throughout. And the reason is that communist China sees Huawei ZTE 5G equipment space as the digital version of their Belt and Road Initiative. And so I think understanding that that's their perspective, I think helped to strengthen sort of the international resolve to ensure that carriers and customers have choices other than Huawei and ZTE.
Yeah, you know, I have to tell you, one of my favorite frustrating moments in the Huawei debate around the country was with my friends in Great Britain, who just could not get over. I think the security services said this is bad, and the political folks said, yeah, but we need this. Trade is really important. And it was hard for some countries to give them some slack to balance that trade versus security conversation. But when they did the test of Huawei gear, the security services came back and said, yes, the gear that they provided us and the software is fine. The problem is when they put it up on when Huawei came in to put it up on the pole, it was different. different equipment and different software.
So this is a key issue. So yeah, Great Britain, they had this great testing regime, and they would require every device to sort of go in there and they would check it out, and to your point, it'd be fine. But what's interesting about Huawei is all their gear is bespoke, and they would, even in the US, they would send their engineers to rural America to put this stuff up on the towers to program it. And at that point, we have no idea what is happening with that gear when it's up there. So the testing regime that they used overseas was not a great model, given the way this gear was being actually installed and operated in the US and in other countries.
Yeah, it was, and it was a hard conversation to have, but you all, big pat on the back for that. You guys got on that early and were able to work through it. How do you see, well, let me ask you this. Where do you see the Huawei issue today internationally? I mean, it seems like we've done a good job collectively of warning even our allies that, hey, this is a real problem. What do you think? I mean, China writes blank checks to these companies. I mean, they're not going away.
Yeah, we're in really good shape here, obviously, in the US. We've, stopped allowing what we call subsidized Huawei gear into our network, which is gear that is funded through the Universal Service Program. This is the federal program that makes it affordable to build out internet service in rural America. We left a loophole, though, where if you were to use private dollars, you could still put that same gear in the same place in the network. And I called some attention to that earlier in the year, and I think you all helped echo some of those comments and concerns as well. That was very helpful. And in fact, the FCC now has an open proceeding looking at closing that loophole so that it won't matter whether it's private dollars or public dollars. We don't want this gear in our network. And there's now bipartisan, bicameral legislation in Congress that would do that as well. Overseas, it's a mixed story. I think Europe is in a decent spot. I think the tide is turning very strongly away from Huawei there. Africa, South America is a different story. They've got, I don't have the exact data in front of me, but something like 70 to 80% market penetration there. They got out ahead early in those markets, and it's going to be very, very difficult to unwind the depth of Huawei and ZTE penetration in Africa and in South America. And so I think, part of that comes down to, we have to assess how much information do we share, what information we want hitting those types of networks. So I think we might be trending in that direction with respect to those countries. I don't know that there's much more that can be done given the depth of penetration there. So great story in the US, good story in Europe, and not looking great when it comes to Africa and South America, but we'll see what we can do there.
Yeah, well, free is hard to compete with. Yep. Right? They would come in and say, don't pay us anything for X amount of time. We'll put it up. We'll supply engineers and we'll operate it. Won't cost you anything for whatever, fill in the blank, because they weren't really interested in the money-making piece. They were interested in the data control piece, I think.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And again, you think of it as the digital version of Belt and Road, where they would, Communist China would basically build these ports and railroads for countries in Africa, load them up with debt, and then when the time comes to pay, they repossess the port or repossess the railroad. That's one level of harm. But when you're talking about data being the thing at issue and the ability to repossess that data, that's a whole other degree of risk.
Yeah. So we'll get a little bit in the weeds here, but you talked about the importance of getting the number of towers, our ability to build towers, because 5G is going to require more sites. What do you think the FCC's role can and should be, if any, in trying to help clear out some of the regulatory underbrush that just makes it so darn difficult to get this stuff up?
Yeah, this has to do with that generational upgrade. So again, 3G, 4G principally relied on these large macro sites, what we call. So these are these 200-300 foot towers that beam relatively high speed service in the 3G and 4G sense, many miles around. And the way you punch up the speeds and the capacity with 5G is you do what we call densify the network. So you add, many times, maybe 10 times the sites that you already have. So you have one macro site, you build around that with maybe 10 small cell sites. That's how you punch up the speeds and the capacity for 5G. So we had siting approval process in this country that maybe it made sense when you had to deal with one macro tower that was covering lots of people and lots of geography, but we need to increase the cadence of infrastructure builds 10x in some cases. our process was broken. It cost too much. It took too long. That's why you saw a flatlining of builds in the US when other countries were ramping up. And so we went in and we looked at environmental and historic preservation rules, which again, maybe they made sense for 200 or 300-foot towers, but they didn't make sense when you're adding a pizza box size small cell on an existing utility pole. So we modernized environmental and historic. We looked at state and local. There were some of the biggest cities in the country that were must-serve cities from a 5G perspective: Manhattan, New York, obviously, San Jose, San Francisco. In many cases, those cities were charging $1 million for a carrier just to have the ability to sit at the table and then negotiate per site fees to build out. And to some extent, hats off to the mayors that could command those fees. But the problem from a national perspective was that sucked up all the capital that could have been used to build out into the rural community. So we stepped in and put some guardrails in place to make sure that cities always get their costs back, but they shouldn't be, adding unnecessarily to the cost of building out 5G. And we engaged in a number of other orders as well to try to streamline that effort. And that's why you saw that jump from 708 cell sites, or at least partly why you saw the jump from 708 new cell sites in 2016 to over 46,000 in 2019. So we can't afford any backsliding on that issue. All of those decisions were challenged by big cities, and either entirely or at least in the main, the courts upheld the FCC's decisions there.
I mean, are you saying that local governments were gouging? I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Say it ain't so. Say it ain't so.
That's right. That's right. Well, I should also give a shout out to the Republican leader on House Energy and Commerce, Kathy Morse Rogers. She's put together a package of 28 infrastructure bills that would either codify or extend a lot of those reforms that the FCC did. And to me, there's a lot of talk in DC right now about infrastructure, and that's welcome and that's great, but it's a one-sided conversation. I think the Biden administration is focused on billions of dollars, which is good. We need more money, but if you're just funding it and you're not streamlining on the other hand, then you're just jumping on the gas and the brakes at the same time. So we could pair all those ideas that Congresswoman Rogers has on the infrastructure side and pair it with funding, then you really got something going. And I think that's what we need to try to turn the attention towards a little bit here.
Yeah, which really is a great point. To the next question on, we're really talking about in this space, you're really competing in a regulatory environment. So you're competing sometimes against another country's regulatory environment for speed. So China, they do what they need to do, and they use all of the forces that they have in order to build. If they're going in one direction, by God, everybody is going in that direction. Every aspect of the government. Here, we don't quite operate that way. Neither do we in Europe. Can you talk a little bit about those regulatory frameworks? I mean, where are we in relation to, say, even our European friends versus, say, China? And what does that mean? And so I think that was your point in that last piece. But what does it mean? I mean, we're really competing. Technology is great. They've got good technology. We've got better technology, but we're not competing directly with that. We have these regulatory events that we're competing against.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when you flash back to the point at which Communist China was building out 5G at a pace that was ahead of the US, 2015, 2016, a lot of people looked at that Communist China model and thought we had to be like China to beat China. And there was all these ideas for, a government run and owned wireless network. There's been people pushing for decades to get municipal governments deeper into the game of providing internet service. And that's not the path for us in the US. And in fact, not a shocker to you or anybody, if you scratch below the surface of the numbers that the Communist China regime is putting out on their 5G builds, the numbers start to fall away. So they're great at, these, debt-fueled construction projects, but they end up building these ghost cities where nobody lives. And the 5G network is very similar. They would tout all these numbers about these cell sites that they'd put up, but their system is rotten at the core. They cannot match supply with demand. And so they're putting up all these cell sites. And the truth was, they weren't even bringing power to those cell sites because there was no one there to actually, receive the signal or use it. So they would tout these great numbers. And because they can't match supply with demand, they weren't even turning the cell sites on. But you had a lot of people in the media and analysts touting these great numbers coming out of China because they had these, dead sticks in the air, not able to provide service. So We turned away from that. We rejected, nationalization of the networks in the U.S., which surprisingly gained some traction among historically conservative folks in the administration the last couple of years. And our approach in the U.S. is modern infrastructure rules, getting unnecessary red tape out of the way, and letting the private sector build. And then you switch over to Europe and you compare it there. Again, they've got a slightly different approach, more heavy-handed regulation. And you see that in the data, particularly around COVID-19. When the US, because of our regulatory framework, providers invest roughly 2 times per subscriber in the networks here in the US than the regulatory counterparts do in Europe. And when COVID-19 hit, we had this massive surge in internet usage, something like 20 to 30-fold increase. And that made it not seem like a lot in the abstract, but if you think about it, network engineers plan for 5-10% increase in network traffic per year. So effectively, we had maybe 2 years worth of projected traffic growth loaded onto the network overnight. And regulators in Europe were very worried that their continent's networks were going to break. They asked Netflix and other streaming services to degrade the quality of their service so that they weren't taking up as much bandwidth. We didn't have any of those challenges in the US because the framework we put in place incentivized, massive levels of investment. So when you look at some of those 3 main approaches, the US approach, the European approach, and the approach taken in communist China, obviously we have the right approach. And the performance that you saw in the US during COVID-19 compared to Europe, compared to China, where they also saw significant slowdowns in speed, I think that was the ultimate global stress test for telecom policy, and the US has it right.
Yeah, no, that's great. I have to say, I was in China where at the time that they were all going to build out high-speed cable. By the way, it wasn't even before fiber optics, and they took me to this factory of which was, massive. 4 or 5 football fields just full of this round spooled cable that they made. And I was talking to the plant manager, and I said, "My God, you have this much request. You have a demand signal for all of this." And I said, "Well, where does it all go?" And he said, well, I don't know. The government just tells us to produce X% more per day, and we build it and we put it in the factory. They had nowhere for it to go, which is to me, that would just set it all for that communist approach to production. They had plenty of it, by the way, nowhere for it to go, but they sure had plenty of it. So talk about this debate, if you would, on O-RAN. Can you explain what it is? Explain, is this the solution? Is this where we should be going? Is it going to help push back on where we see the Chinese Communist Party trying to build out around the world?
Yeah, O-RAN is an interesting part of the solution, both in terms of addressing the threats coming out of communist China, but also sort of separate from the security part, just a more efficient network. The way to think about O-RAN, it's the unbundling or the separating of the software and the hardware layer. And that separation of software and hardware is something that we have seen historically in the tech sector that has inured to the benefit of consumers. So just think about the home PC market. When Apple first launched the home PC, back in the 1980s, it was bundled. So you bought, your hardware from Apple, and all the operating system, the software was from Apple as well. And Dell, IBM, others came in and disrupted that market by separating it. So we're going to build just the hardware, and someone else is going to be able to compete on the software layer. And that has the upshot of driving down prices and increasing innovation. And that's what we're seeing with O-RAN in the wireless sector. So where one vendor, whether it's Nokia or Ericsson, would have a vertically integrated system that a carrier would purchase. You're buying their hardware, you're buying their software. In a lot of ways, it doesn't even interoperate very well with a competing vendor. So carriers would have to build one Nokia city and then one Ericsson city. You couldn't, intermingle them in the same market. So what O-RAN is doing is going to enable us to have the hardware be a lot less expensive, and we're going to move the brains of the operation to the software layer that can go on that hardware. That has a lot of benefits, one of which is you don't need to be a Huawei or a ZTE now to compete in that space, because the competition is at the coding level, and that plays to an enduring US strength in coding and software. So now you can have a lot of smaller upstart US companies that can, through software and coding, replicate the performance that you used to get from a bespoke, expensive piece of Huawei gear. So I think it's great from a competition perspective, because a lot of people said, all right, you're kicking Huawei and ZTE out. What am I going to use? And well, in addition to what's already out there, Nokia, Ericsson, et cetera, you now have the ability to use trusted, smaller vendors in the O-RAN space. It's still early days with O-RAN, and we want to, from a regulatory perspective, give the private sector choice, but we're not going to mandate it. But hopefully this is going to continue to mature in a way that, again, will be more efficient, more cost effective, and give people an option that's something other than Huawei or ZTE.
Yeah. And it makes sense to do that. If we mandate it, it seems to me you're disadvantaging, because the companies were going in a certain way because that's what the regulatory framework told them they ought to do for their businesses. Well, if you do that overnight, it really, to me, it advantages China. And I don't know why we would do that. I like that idea of saying, hey, you need to know what it is. We need to try to get there. We're not gonna take you off the playing field because we're in a hurry on O-RAN. But one of the things I like about O-RAN is your ability that our developers can lay something over that commodity piece of radio that's on the tower. And I think that's where American innovation wins in this all day long. VPNs, you can network slice, all of those things become possible to me in a way that isn't today. And do you sense that where do you sense that the companies are today? So O-RAN, yes, but where are these big companies? We don't really have companies like a Nokia or an Ericsson in the United States producing this stuff. And so how would you gauge the health of that ecosystem for liberal democracies versus authoritarian, communist and dictatorships?
It's interesting. Again, looking back the last couple of years, this was another instance where we had a bit of a hiccup of an idea that came out of some in the administration that thought we needed to, as a government, take a stake in one of these foreign equipment vendors due to wanting them to succeed and wanting to have a viable option other than Huawei, ZTE. And obviously, I didn't think that was a great idea. But I do think that O-RAN is one way that we can do this. We do have a lot of relatively smaller US-based providers right now that are working in the O-RAN space. And I think that's great. There's been a lot of requests to help them out through funding and whatnot. And I leave that to others to sort of figure out. But I do think this is a good spot that we're in. Dish, which is working to build out their new network, has basically gone all in on O-RAN. And I think if that succeeds, that can be another good boost to help move that process along even faster.
Yeah, talk about the military implications of both where 4G to 5G, 5G to 6G. Is this something that should have should raise to a higher level of discussion across our national security infrastructure about where we're going? So clearly China sees an advantage in 5G. I think it's for data collection and data ownership as much as it is speed and sensors development and analytics. But I just get your sense of that. One of the things we saw was China does have an interest in 5G applied to military usage. What about 6G? Is that something that we need to scramble around and think about?
Yeah, I think the federal government users, including the military, obviously are in many ways embracing the benefits of 5G. And there's some different test beds that are going on right now on different military bases where they're testing out, how 5G can be beneficial to them. And I'm sure that the same thing is going to happen on the 6G front. Historically in spectrum policy, there's always this tension between the FCC on the one hand and federal users on the other. And the reality is there's mission critical operations that our federal partners need to be able to perform. Spectrum is a key piece of that. It'll be 5G, it'll be 6G. So we need to make sure they can perform their functions. At the same time, if we can't compete on the commercial side and have the spectrum to compete on the commercial side, that's a threat as well. And so I do think it's good that the federal government users and the military users are seeing the upside to their own ability to use 5G and 6G services. And we just gotta, work through this. And at the end of the day, it comes down to the FCC making tough calls on when to reallocate spectrum from federal to commercial use. I think we've struck the right balance so far. And I think we've got to continue to lean in because, we're charged with, being the experts on how to get this right from a national perspective. And, we're never going to necessarily see eye to eye on every single spectrum ban or interference measure with federal users. But at the end of the day, if we're successful with 5G and 6G, it's going to benefit, federal and private sector users alike.
Yeah. So, and you've been pushing for more restrictions on Chinese gear. I think the commission is looking at that. What would that look like in your mind?
Yeah, there's sort of two ideas here. One of which we touched on, which is this idea that we've prohibited Huawei and ZTE gear from going into networks if the carrier is receiving federal dollars to help build that out, which is great. And that addressed a significant portion of the threat. But we left this loophole wide open where if the same carrier using private funds could buy the same equipment and stick it in the same place in the network, and I think that's a problem. And so we've now started a process at the FCC to close that loophole. The other piece of it, though, that I've talked about is just looking more generally at the human rights abuses taking place in communist China. And I've put forward an idea that says, well, there's no equipment that emits, RF energy. Any electronics equipment has to go through FCC approval before it can lawfully operate in the U.S. And so I've said we should use that equipment authorization process to require entities that have their equipment built in communist China, whether it's Apple or otherwise, we need to hold them to a higher standard to prove that forced labor wasn't used anywhere in that supply chain. I very firmly believe that we're going to flash forward, I don't know how many years, 2 years, 3 years, in the consensus on doing business in particularly the Xinjiang region of China, where you've got, the forced labor and the genocide of the Uyghur population. There's going to be a tipping point in this country when corporations are going to have to pull out of supporting the genocide of Uyghurs. Obviously, I think we are past that point, and we should be past that point, but yet we don't seem to be. And I think that tipping point is going to come. And I think we need to start the process now from an equipment authorization process saying, are you in the Xinjiang region? If so, we're going to hold you to a higher bar to prove that the communist regime isn't using you to profit off of forced labor. And I really feel very firmly that, again, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, there's going to be a consensus in the US, and people are going to look back and say, why didn't more people do more faster? And I certainly don't want to be one of the ones that was looked at as not advocating enough, not pushing enough. So I do think that's another area that we should open up in the US.
Yeah, and that's so you're looking at kind of a proactive standard, which some of our European allies talked about. Like maybe we can create a standard that we should meet, and China likely won't meet because they can't meet it. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. And that now our regulatory scheme isn't trying to compete against an open, holes barred, we cheat, we steal, we use forced labor, we don't care, we're just going to win. Right. And I'm all for competition. That's not competition.
Right.
And so I really like that. How do you get a sense that the commission is there or moving that way, or is this going to be a slow and steady slog?
Well, on the first piece, the closing the loophole so that we can't have Huawei gear coming in with private funds, that seems to be trending in the right direction. We just opened a proceeding on that. The second piece of it, which is to put equipment manufacturers to a higher bar to show that they're not using forced labor, isn't gaining a ton of traction. There's obviously some interest on the Hill, particularly among some Republicans for that. But there's not a ton of bipartisanship at this point behind that idea. I know, equipment vendors are not going to be big fans of it. They're going to say that, we do our best already. And this is just going to be more cost without more benefit. I take that perspective, but I do think we should push forward. And it's disappointing that there's not more momentum behind that idea at this point in time. But I do think it's an idea whose time, well, in my view, has come. And I think more broadly, it's an idea whose time, will very soon come.
Yeah, no, Commissioner Carr, thanks for that. I'm going to turn it over to Dan Mahaffey, who's going to field some questions. He's also spent a lot of time in one of those important authors of our CSPC report on the status of 5G and 6G. So I'll turn it over to Dan, if you don't mind, and then we'll wrap up after that. Dan?
Thanks, Chairman, and thank you, Commissioner. And folks, if you do have questions, please submit them in the Q&A or chat. One question, Commissioner, we see these proposals on infrastructure on the Hill right now, and they seem to be very broadband focused. How do you get wireless and 5G into the closing the digital divide discussion better and faster?
There's some interesting features of the Biden administration's plan for closing the digital divide. And there's some components of it that at the end of the day would take us backwards. So I was just last week out in rural North Idaho. I was with a fixed wireless provider that is now offering 100 megabit per second down, 20 megabit per second up speed. And they were able to do it off of one tower, and they were able to serve 5,000 locations with it. Now, if we were to bring fiber to all 5,000 of those, one, it would be about 10x the cost. Two, and this is the more important piece, is the timeline. It could take 5 or more years to bring fiber to those houses. So one error that I think the Biden administration's plan makes is that it's basically a fiber only play, and it would subsidize fiber everywhere. And obviously fiber is going to be the lion's share of the connections in this country. But when you look at that last few percentage of this country that doesn't have anything today, in a matter of days, you can put a fixed wireless connection up, then get 100 megabit per second service for 10x less the cost, immediately. And so I think we need to have every tool in the toolkit. Let's put fiber every single place where it makes sense to put fiber, but let's leave options as well for fixed wireless. I think that mix of technology at the last mile is going to be what we need to do to get the job done.
One of the things too, what are some near-term priorities that the FCC sees for Congress on spectrum authority? Where does that stand?
Well, the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority expires next year or so, so we need Congress to reauthorize that. Separately, I've laid out what I view as what I've described as a spectrum roadmap that walks through what we need to do to maintain our leadership in 5G. And I think we need to get our 3.45 auction done this year, which thankfully, knock on wood, we look to be on track. I've said we need to auction 2.5 spectrum we have sitting at the FCC this year. Doing that does not look like it's on track. I've said we need to open up some proceedings to look at some greater use of 6 gigahertz spectrum, Uni 2C spectrum, and then my calendar includes ideas for 2022 and beyond 2022. So the transition from 16 to 17 was the spectrum cupboards were bare. We had to identify the spectrum and get the spectrum out there, which we've done. The good news now is the spectrum cupboard's not bare. We have a tremendous amount of bands in the pipeline. Now it comes down to just sticking with the timeline and getting it out there. So we need to do that. And any help that Congress can give us, including by forcing us to move forward and quickly on these identified spectrum bands, I think would be beneficial.
Where do you see when we think of 5G and some of these stories we see too about these hacks in the news, now targeting a wider range of supply chain factors, how should we think about hacking, cybersecurity, and security alongside this 5G deployment of a greater number of connected devices?
Obviously, as a general matter, we've been getting a lot better on the security front. That said, there have been a disturbing number of cyber intrusions over the last few months in particular. The way it generally works in the telecom space is DHS is the sector-specific lead. And during the Obama administration, there was an effort in the FCC to basically stand up a parallel cyber regime. And I didn't think that was the right approach. There needs to be one table. That table should be at DHS. We need to have a seat at that table. And I think that's the best way to manage cyber threats in this country, is to have the FCC's network and other expertise brought to bear, but let's run this through the DHS regime.
And then in the gap of, so many people talk in Washington now about the gap between innovation and commercialization, taking that next step, and how important it is when talking about the first mover advantage in technology. And how do we get it to, the Chinese have plenty of pilot programs and demonstrations they'll show, but how do we get greater adoption of 5G in these areas we talk about, agriculture, manufacturing, autonomous vehicles? How do we, in some ways, speed that up to our advantage?
We're trending very much in the right direction. And, the good news is there's always this chicken and the egg challenge when it comes to an upgrade of technology. Is the killer app going to be on the front end pulling adoption, or are you going to get the network out there and then just the massive capacity that is now out there operates as a vacuum and pulls, innovation up onto the network? And still TBD, I think, which way we're going to go this time around. But precision ag is going to be an interesting use case. I was just out in Eastern Washington with Congresswoman Rogers, and we were at a farm that's using, drones and sensors and connected combines. I think that's going to be a really interesting use case, because if you think about it, you've got every plant right now, you can pull about 28 gigabits of data, whether it's high-res imaging, soil moisture, soil chemistry per plant. And so if you think about the average acre of cropland, that's as much data as about 28 libraries of Congress. So that's why we got to drive these high capacity connections out to rural America, where there's not a lot of people, because again, that one plant pulling 28 gigs of data off it, that's more than double what your average smartphone uses per month. So you can think about each plant as basically a little smartphone, and that gives you a sense about why we got to drive these connections out there. But I think that's going to be an interesting use case. Precision ag, telehealth is going to continue to be an important one. AR, VR, I think, could be a game changer in terms of consumer experiences and use cases that'll help further drive 5G. So there's some interesting ones out there.
How are 5G and other measures at the Commission helping to address connectivity for tribal communities?
This continues to be a challenge. We are not where we need to be as a country in terms of connectivity on tribal lands. I was just out on the Coeur d'Alene reservation just last week, meeting with the local broadband provider and actually a member of the tribe as well. And there's a lot of efforts that we're undertaking to do that, to close the divide there. One is this emergency broadband benefit program the FCC has stood up. This was at the direction of Congress with congressional funding through one of the coronavirus relief packages. But this gives a $75 per month credit to purchase high-speed service. It's a significant upgrade in terms of quality and amount of support over our Lifeline program. I was speaking on the reservation with some of the folks there, and they're pushing that program as well. So I think at least in the short term, continue to spread the word about the emergency broadband benefit program is one way that we can deal with it. Because again, there's two components of the digital divide. Is the infrastructure there? And then can you afford to purchase a service on that infrastructure? And we're tackling both fronts.
Final question, and I think a way to look at this, perhaps the 5G is targeted by so many disinformation actors, conspiracy theorists about 5G. At the same time, the public, they see it as perhaps a new light comes on the top of their phone, but there's not much more beyond that on the carrier. How can, beyond conversations like we're having now, how can policymakers, members of Congress, leaders better communicate to the American people the importance of this technological competition, but also that it is part of this struggle with authoritarians as well?
Well, it's interesting. Whenever we have an upgrade in technology like this, and I'm talking historically, two things happen. One, we see a big jump in innovation, and two, we see a run on tinfoil hats. And I think that has certainly played out with 5G as well. But again, you go back to the advent of AM and FM radio, there are all sorts of conspiracy theories about how those airwaves were going to be bad for you. Obviously, none of this stuff is correct. It's just that conspiracy theories can catch fire and go viral much more quickly today than it could back then. So I do think it's important that we talk about, one, we have to debunk the conspiracy theories. I did a Twitter thread maybe over a year ago at this point, walking through some of these oddball 5G conspiracy theories and debunking them. But how we talk about 5G, I've always put it in three buckets, which is one, everything you can do on your smartphone today is going to be better and faster. That's great, but it's actually the least interesting part. 4G was basically a network built for smartphones, or maybe the way you conceive of it is vice versa, but the smartphone was the main function of 4G. That's not going to be the case with 5G. The second bucket of 5G is in-home broadband. You can now get wirelessly the same speeds and performance that before you had to have a fiber or cable connection. And that third bucket is this whole new wave of innovations, whether it's AR, VR, or otherwise. So the 5G network is going to support all these use cases. It's not just going to be, about a high performance, smartphones the way 4G was. And so that's one way I try to describe it to people.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And I'll hand it back to the chairman and Representative Nye.
Well, thanks, Dan. And thanks, Commissioner. Again, thanks for taking so much time today. And thanks for your thoughtful explanation on some pretty complicated stuff. You need to get out on the road a lot more to help America understand the importance of this. I'm sure you're busy enough, but we'd love for you to do that. And again, thanks for taking some time with us today. Thanks for the work that you're doing. And I hope to talk to you soon. And I'll turn it over to our CEO and President, Glenn Nye.
Just like to add my thanks to what Mike said. Commissioner Carr, thank you for the work you've taken on at the FCC, to you and your colleagues. Thanks to Mike for moderating a really interesting conversation today, and Dan for fielding the questions. We tend to focus at the center on areas where there are rapidly developing technologies related to national security, because we feel like, to be fair to policymakers, it can be hard to keep up with the implications of technologies that are moving this quickly, and to keep their constituents informed in the right way about the implications. So we believe that our work is hopefully helpful in clarifying some of those questions. And we're always excited to connect with the policy folks like yourself who are living it, the struggle and the challenge every day, and hope that our work is additional to the efforts you're undertaking. So appreciate your time and your leadership on this, and hope to talk to you again. Thanks to our participants for joining us today. We'll see you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.